We were reading this. I went to get a haircut yesterday. And when I get a haircut, it always reminds me of the difference between accuracy and precision. Because they always ask you what I want. And then I have to take off my glasses while they actually do the haircut. And so the next time I see it is when it's all over. So I get to find out. Yesterday I had a guy that was very precise, but not necessarily very accurate. Because what I said I wanted and what I actually got are not the same thing. However, he spent a lot of time giving me what I did get. And he was very good and very precise. He was all over the thing. And I just kept seeing all his hair dropping off my head. And I kept thinking, gosh, that seems like a lot of hair. And then he kept saying, and then he would go aside, and then he'd come back and he'd do it again. And he kept kind of going back to the same areas. I'm like, this is not going to go well, is it? So speaking of accuracy and precision, let's talk about justice. Because that's what it's all about. So Micah 6:8, many of you probably have heard this verse. He has told you, O man, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you, but to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God. Now, on the face of it, besides being a great song, what does this tell you at a high level? If you were just to read this verse, what does it tell you? What does the Lord, what's the key word there? Require. And we're going to talk about a little bit about what's mentioned, justice, kindness, and walking humbly. But what does it mean the Lord requires this of you? There's no choice because it's expected, right? The Lord has expectations. Here's a minimum standard that you are to follow, right? And then we see in Romans 2 that he will render to each according to his deeds. Eternal life to those who by patient continuance and seeking for glory, honor, and immortality, and indignation and wrath for those who are self-seeking and do not obey the truth. All right. Now we have this Ezekiel 18 passage, though, that if you are honest, should cause you to have some issues. And why is that? The Ezekiel passage, if you read it in the book, but if a wicked man turns from his sins and that which he has committed, keeps all my statutes, and does what is lawful and right, he shall surely live. He shall not die. None of the transgressions which he has committed shall be remembered against him. Now that should cause you problems, and that's the thing we're going to solve by the end of this lesson next week. But this should cause you problems. Why? Knowing what you know about justice. Well, let's start there. What is just? What does it mean to be just? What is justice? No exceptions to the rule.
Like always doing the right thing.
Okay. Always doing the right thing. Anyone else?
A penalty being paid.
A penalty being paid.
Or just when justice is brought in a situation, it's the righteousness and the right thing being brought to a situation.
Okay. So a penalty being paid for doing wrong. And what else? This is important. A reward for doing right. Okay, that's how God has set up the world. Don't misunderstand. We're not making this up. This is how God has set up the world. He is the rewarder of those who do right, and he is the punisher of those who do wrong. And that's what we call justice. Okay? The justice is, if you go by the dictionary definition, justice is based on or behaving according to what is morally right. So we have a movie out called The Justice League. What are they all about? Come on, somebody had to watch it. The Hall of Justice. Did anybody watch those cartoons when they were a kid? All right. What was? Thank you. Superman. Yes. And what do they do? What do they used to do, anyways? Now they're kind of weird, but what do they used to do?
Truth, justice, and the American way.
Yes, that was the original Superman motto from the 1940s. And it was actually a piece of propaganda, because what happened when you put all those three things together, truth, justice, and the American way, what are you saying? You equate them. And what were we in the 40s? 1941 specifically. Oh, wow. Isn't that amazing? That truth, justice, and the American way are all the same thing. It's funny. But truth and justice, that was what he stood for. He fought against the bad guys. And the bad guys were always obviously bad, and he was good, and he always did the right thing. That was what it was all about. He was all about truth and justice. That's what was cool about Superman. That's why they ruined him in the latest movie, but that's a whole different question. So, justice and righteousness mean the same thing, and they both mean to do what is right. Okay? So, when we come to us, we call this morality. Okay? To do what is right is to do what is moral. Okay? Is that God-given characteristic of men that helps us to know intuitively what is right and wrong, good and evil. So, is there a right and wrong? Let me ask you that.
Yes.
Okay? Robin's shaking your head now. Are you a Buddhist now? What's
Not in postmodern America.
Right. That's a death.
There's no right.
Do you accept one, right? If you watch Kung Fu Panda, you've got the turtle, Master Igwe. There is no...
We don't have a TV.
Okay,
We're really
never
lost in
mind.
this class.
You're talking about a high
I
context.
retain.
Whatever context you're in, it's going way over my head.
Fine. I don't watch that much TV, I just retain it. It's Netflix, by the way, it's not just TV. I watched no, it's a good movie. It really is. Kung Fu Panda. The Justice League was from the 80s. I have my rotation of shows when I came home from school. Tom and Jerry, Transformers, Super Friends, G.I. Joe. Okay. And then I went out and I ran my bike until my parents called me up. That's what I did. All right. Back on topic. So, we have right and wrong. And now Robin brings up a good point. He brings up the question of, in postmodern America, is there a right and wrong? And really, there are cultures like Buddhism where it's not necessarily a concept of right and wrong. It's kind of what's best for you and what's not so good. And so a lot of Americanism, a lot of humanism, evolutionism would say there is a right and wrong because there's things that are good for society and things that are not so good for society. And so your basis is all relative, okay? And when we're saying about morality and when we look at justice, what we're saying is there actually is a absolute right and an absolute wrong. There really is a line that you have that you would cross to do wrong, okay? And how do we know what that is? We'll talk about that in a second, okay? There's a quote here by Richard Strauss. While the most common Old Testament word for just means straight and the New Testament word means equal, in a moral sense they both mean right. When we say that God is just, we are saying that he always does what is right, what should be done, and that he does it consistently without partiality or prejudice. The word just and the word righteous are identical in both the Old Testament and the New Testament. Sometimes the translators render the original word just and other times righteous with no apparent reason. But whichever word they use, it essentially means the same thing. It has to do with God's actions. They are always right and fair. Okay? So justice means that God always thinks and does what is right. Does that make sense? We have to, because this should challenge you a little bit. And I'm going to push you because I'm sure a lot of you guys probably are familiar with this. But the challenge is thinking rightly about what is right, if that makes sense. Because it's not as easy as it sounds. Okay? Because where does God get his concept of what is right and wrong? Based on what? Because he's just, so therefore he acts justly. He is just, so therefore he acts justly. Okay, let's look at some scriptures before we start going too far down that path, because that should start to throw you a little bit. We're in a lot of the same arguments as we were with truth. He is truthful because he tells the truth, and he tells the truth because he's truthful. He's just because he acts justly, and he acts justly because he's just. You have a lot of circular logic there, right? So, when we say that justice requires God to do something, is that a fair statement?
Yes.
Why?
Because there is injustice and sin in the world, so God has to act
Okay.
in response to that.
Okay. So let's read some of these verses, and I want you to think about what you just said. but thanks for setting me up. All right. Deuteronomy 23. I proclaim the name of the Lord, ascribe greatness I ascribe greatness to our God. He is the rock, his work is perfect, for all his ways are justice, a God of truth and without injustice, righteous and upright is he. Psalm 19. The law of the Lord is perfect, converting the soul. The testimony of the Lord is sure, making wise the simple, and so on. And lastly, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. Okay, Isaiah 45, and Isaiah goes into a lot of detail on God's justice. He goes through it a lot, chapter over chapter, trying to understand what the difference is between him and Israel, the way he's going to act, the way that they've acted, idols, idolatry, wandering of Israel. So he goes through a lot about justice, and it's a really beautiful book. For thus does the Lord, who created the heavens, who is God, who formed the earth and made it, who has established it, who did not create it in vain, who formed it to be inhabited. I am the Lord, and there is no other. I have not spoken in secret, in a dark place of the earth. I did not say to the seed of Jacob, seek me in vain. I, the Lord, speak righteousness. I declare things that are right. That's key, okay? I, the Lord, speak righteousness, and I declare things that are right. Psalm 11:7. For the Lord is righteous. He loves righteousness. Jumping down to Psalm 92. I declare that the Lord is upright. He is my rock, and there is no unrighteousness in him. Okay, and then we have 1 John, where Jesus Christ is called the righteous, and then Romans 9, where Paul asks the rhetorical question, there is no injustice in God, is there? May it never be. In other words, no, there isn't. Right? That's just, it's a way of saying that. So, everything that God does is right. As he says in Isaiah 45, he declares the things that are right. Okay? And so we end up with this circular reasoning. Now, does that bother you a little bit? And it should, if you come up with justice requires God to do a certain thing. Why does that statement? What is that?
It wounds my pride.
It wounds Robin's pride. It should wound all of our pride. Why does it ruin our pride? And why does justice, why can justice not compel God to do anything?
That would make God beholden to a higher standard.
Exactly.
There is no higher standard than him. He is the ultimate standard. You can't go beyond.
Right? If God has to ascribe to a system of justice, then somebody else had to make that system of justice. Right? And then God would have to be compelled to obey that system of justice. Does that make sense?
But he made the system of justice.
Uh-huh.
Somebody else didn't make it.
Right.
Well, we make it in our own minds, and then we make
Yeah.
God try to conform to it.
That's different. When we make our own system of justice and say God has to act a certain way, that's just us putting him in a box. But when we look at God in the scriptures, when he says this is just, how do we know that it's just?
Because he's God and he cannot lie. He's truthful.
Mm-hmm.
He's a God of truth, and so he cannot lie.
Okay. Keep going. He's truthful. He cannot lie.
And he's just.
He is the originator of what is just. The reason we consider something to be just or something to be right is because he did it. Does that make sense? Just like truth. The reason it's truth is because God said that it's true. Because he's the one who determines what is real. Truth is not necessarily a false, it's reality. This is how to really see the world. This is what's true about the world. You can pretend like the sky is green, and you're welcome to sit there and keep telling yourself that the sky is green. But in reality, when God says the sky is blue, it's blue. Because he said it's blue. Right? And you can keep trying to argue with him, but he's right. And in justice, it's the same way. There's no outside standard that God is subscribing to that he's really consistent in pushing. He is the standard. What he does is right. So therefore, when we consider what is right, we look and say, what would God do? Right? WWJD. It's not the worst slogan. It's actually somewhat accurate. In this case, it actually is fairly accurate. How do we know what is right? Because God did it. That makes it right. Do you see why it wounds the pride of man? Because what does that place us into? What do we have to do? Say again?
Doctrines like Arminianism, where we don't want to accept the justice of God along with His love and holiness.
Well, Arminianism doesn't necessarily deny the doctrine of the justice of God. So be careful there. But you're on the right track.
Puts us under His sovereignty.
It puts us under His sovereignty. How?
Because we no longer get to determine right and wrong, we just get a pick.
We no longer determine right and wrong. Keep going, though.
We just get a pick between right and wrong, because right and wrong are defined by God.
Right, which makes us have to submit. Submit and obey. We're back to the same thing on truth, right? Again, we can sit there and talk about how we don't like the way that this turned out. We don't like this truth. It doesn't seem like it should work that way. Whatever else, but that's what God said is right. And so the task is not necessarily just to find out all the reasons why God is right. The task is really to submit and obey, to bow your knee and say, yeah, you're right, God, and I accept that willingly, lovingly, carefully, right? To say, you are the sovereign king and I am just one of your creatures. I am a subject. To bow your knee and become a subject is not the easiest thing in the world for humans to do. But what did Micah 6:8 say that we are to do? What do we start off with?
Do what God requires us.
And what does He require of you, O man? To do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. And how many of those things require you to know a Bible? We'll get to that later. All right? So does that make sense? So this is circular reasoning. It's circular reasoning only in the sense that God is the ultimate cause. And so in this case, it's allowed. He is the definer of the standard. He is the standard. When we say what is right, it's what did God do? How did He treat Balaam? That was right. How does He treat a sinner, sending him to hell? That's just. Right? How did He treat the nations in Canaan? That's just. Does that make sense? That's hard, especially in your Old Testament. When they offered strange fire and He burns them up like that, that's exactly right. When Ananias and Sapphira are burned up like that, that's what's exactly right. When all the bowl judgments and the trumpet judgments and everything else in Revelation, and all these people are scattered and cowering under rocks, that's right. That is the correct action for Him to take. And we are not to sit there and argue and say, that seems mean. We are to say, yes, Lord, it's exactly good. And that's exactly right. And I am assured that you are doing the right thing. Does that mean we are to go do those things? No, that's different.
I might be jumping ahead of you, but it's also as just to send a person to heaven. You'll probably get there.
Yep. We're going to leave it on a tough note today. And then we'll figure it out as we go through. All right, you still with me? Any questions? Anybody bothered? Figure out my Hall of Justice reference yet? Robin, I can't believe you didn't watch that. Your kids should have watched it. It's a great show. All right, so if you argue with it, who argued with this system of justice? Satan? But we don't have any direct testimonies of Satan. Who else in your Old Testament? Abraham, somewhat.
Pretty much everybody.
Yeah, pretty much. A lot of people had their issues with what God had taken and the actions that God had taken. But one person in particular had a whole book written about him. Okay, not Jonah. But it starts with a J. Job, thank you. That was a very good reference. I'm sorry. Job responded back. Because remember what happened to Job. So God allowed Satan to do all these things, right? And Satan brought all these calamities, but it's always interesting that he said this far and no further, and that's as far as Satan could go. And so Job was patiently dealing with a wife that told him to curse God and die. He was told by friends that there's something wrong with you. You must have done something wrong. You must have done something wrong. And Job continues, how? Pretty faithfully through all that. But then he hits his breaking point. And do you remember what happened to Job at that point? What did he start to say? What kind of things did he start to say?
Isn't that when he was really just questioning God?
How? What was he saying?
Is that when he said, why I cursed the day I was born? That kind of stuff? Is that what you're looking for?
To a degree. Keep going.
An explanation.
I'm not necessarily asking for a right answer. I want you guys to kind of think this through in your own head, right? What was Job was looking for an explanation? Why?
He didn't think it was just.
Because he didn't think it was just. That was kind of that's a cheating answer because that's the lesson we're in. But why? What kind of things was he saying?
Didn't you want to be in court with God?
Yeah, there's a lot of judicial language. Why? You're giving me the setting. What were some of his arguments? Just the crux. Don't worry about verses.
He'd done everything right. He was just.
He did everything right.
And everything was coming against him. And
He
wanted
did.
to know why.
Exactly. He did everything right, and yet everything was going wrong. Right? He did everything right according to what? His own understanding of what he wanted God to do. Now, was he wrong?
No.
How do we know?
Why not?
How do we know that he wasn't wrong? Because God said, have you seen Job, my righteous servant? He's declaring him to be righteous. He said he's a good guy. He was doing everything right, and yet he let all this stuff come in. So Job lets that go to his head eventually, and he says, wait a second, I've done what is right. I've been righteous before you. I have offered sacrifices. I've been thankful. I've had a good heart towards you. Why is all this bad happening to me? Because good things are supposed to happen to good people, right? Because blessing comes with righteousness, right? Is that generally true? Yes. Is it always true? No. And who determines when those worldly exceptions are going to take place? God does. Ultimately, he has certain standards, and we're going to talk about that. But you can see what's happening with Job. So Job starts to question, God, this isn't right. How come you're not doing what you said you would do? How come you're not following through? I've been right. Where's your side of this bargain? That was kind of the argument that he was getting to. So Job hit that tipping point where now that pride that was actually there in his heart the whole time now finally finds its voice. It bubbles up, and he starts to argue. And so God sits him down, and God then explains his ways and the way that the law works and how he has sin in his heart and the way he needs to adjust and repent. Is that what happened? What did happen?
There's a statement in the book that is awesome. It says he crosses the line, Job, from earnest seeking through prayer and presumptuous cross-examination. So God answers Job not with the justification of his own actions, but a call for Job to review his own reflection.
Yeah, isn't that great? God's response is not to explain to Job all of his ways. What is God's response to Job?
Check your heart attitude.
Check your attitude. Why?
He was questioning God on everything. And God came to him and said, now you will answer me.
Yeah.
Basically, pull up your bootstraps because I'm going to ask you the question.
I'm going to ask you some questions, but what's he trying to get Job to understand?
That Job is but dust.
Okay.
And God
is God, and Job is a subject, and who determines what is right?
God.
And Job, what is your job? To question me? Is it my responsibility to clarify everything with you? No. My job is to do what is right. Your job is to pay attention and worship and listen and obey and enjoy. Those are all things that Job is to do. And Job gets the answer after chapter of where were you when I came up with Leviathan? Where were you when I formed the world? Where were you? It's a great book. I love it. And Job just sits there at the end and just covers his mouth and says, I've spoken when I shouldn't have. It's great because at no point in the book does God ever explain to Job what happened. We enjoy from the narrator or whatever that perspective is in literature. We get to see the whole thing, but Job never gets an explanation. Instead, the whole lesson to Job is all about trusting me when things appear to be not going right. And Job does it. And it's a very powerful book, a very powerful lesson. But the point for us is, when God does something that we don't think is right, the answer is not, God, how could you do this? The answer is, Lord, you're doing what is right. I know you are, because you are the originator of what is right. Now let me see it through your eyes. Let me embrace it because it's from your hand, and let me know that this is right. That's the challenge. Not understanding what is right, that's one thing. Accepting that God does what is right, whole nother thing. Very challenging. But that's our role. We are subjects of the Creator, and we are to embrace him as he moves and as he works. Probably just
I just wonder if you think Job lost his way when he was challenged by all of his friends, because in 121 he says, naked I came from my mother's womb, naked shall I return. The Lord giveth and the Lord
taketh away. Blessed be the Lord.
So he had it right there, but then later on
the best of men are men at best, right? He had the patience of Job. I think that's a Southern expression that comes up.
I was talking to Anna about this morning. It's easy for me to say that I'm a sinner, I'm the chief of sinners, but if someone else calls me the chief,
yeah, exactly.
then all of a sudden, hey, whoa, wait a minute.
Yeah, that's my daughter. I had that lesson this morning. As she goes and she straightens her hair for, I don't know, it's been 20 minutes, 30 minutes. She's got the bathroom door closed. No one else can use it. The boys, who admittedly only take like 5 minutes to get ready, come in there like, Kaylin, come on, we have to use the bathroom. I've only been in here for 5 minutes. She has no reason to believe that, right? She has no clock going. She has absolutely zero facts behind her. And yet she's just arguing because somebody told her she was wrong. And so her reaction is, it doesn't matter what's actually true. What matters is my perception. And so she just starts to fight back. It's a very common thing in my house. So she's my defensive little, I don't care what you just said, it's wrong. I'm going to fight you. And so she just does that. Even though it's like demonstrably wrong, she just fights because that pride. I can't keep that up. It's just the root of sin. It's in all of us. And even in Job. And Job was righteous among us, and he held out for a long time, having false accusations against him, bad theology, bad application, and he kept going righteously for a long time. But he can't go forever. Just like us, he needed grace. And that's the cool thing about Job. Okay, move on. We gotta move on. So that's our general theological understanding of what is right. Whatever God does is right. That defines justice. That is what is just. And our job is to conform to that conception. So, let's talk about justice as we observe it. Okay? Now, we've already talked about the fact that what we think about justice is tainted not by sin, not just by sin, but also by our culture and our understanding. Right? How do we measure justice? When we say something is just or fair, how do we measure it? How should we measure it?
We tend to measure it by our worldview, which, depending on where we are, could be a biblical worldview or could be skewed by the world.
Good.
But it's kind of in my eyes.
Exactly. Now, this is where you're accurate when you say, justice should make me do this. That's better, right? Because now God's not beholden to a concept of justice, but guess what? I am. There is a right and wrong for me. There is what God has told me to do that I need to follow. So there is a right and wrong for us. He does have a standard. Now let's start talking about what some of these standards are. Okay? Romans 1:9. Now Romans 1 through 3 are probably the most complete single, if you will, dissertation on justice in the Scriptures, where Paul deals with a lot of how does God see man, and where does man's sin leave him with God? Romans 1 through 3 is an excellent set of chapters specifically for that, just telling you a lot about that. There's a lot more there too, but definitely for that this particular topic. Now, justice on a human level is how close will we conform to what God said to do. So let's work through this. Romans 1:19 through 21. What may be known of God is manifest to them, talking about all men, for God has shown it to them. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse, because although they knew God, they did not glorify him as God, nor were thankful, but became futile in their thoughts, and their foolish hearts were darkened. So, as we talk about what God's standards are for us, we've now hit 2 verses. Right? In Romans 1, what did he expect? And why would he expect it? Okay, why? Glorification and thankfulness, and why would he expect it? Okay, don't get out of context.
Since God created us and shows himself in his creation, so by nature of being created by him, we're going to have that innately, whether we're lost or saved.
Because the world around us gives us a testimony of his power, his creative ability. Because we can see that what happened around us is too amazing to have happened randomly, just with a bunch of molecules exploding from a single point, all somehow, even though they were equally distributed, they were all somehow glommed together, and they formed these complex materials and complex planets and a complex human form and life out of nothing. I mean, it's just too complex. There's no way that could just happen at random. So this is a testimony of the greatness of God. There must be a creator. He must be incredibly powerful. And there is something about me that has to come before this creator. And what's expected, I should know. I know that I should glorify him. And I know that I should be thankful for the things that he's given. That's what the world tells who? Everyone. There is nobody in this world that does not have that testimony before them. And therefore, there is nobody that does not know what standard of justice. Right? Who doesn't know that there's a creator? Whether you want to deny it or not is a different question. That's not what I'm dealing with. There's a testimony to every person in this world that there is a creator. And there's a testimony that you are to come before that creator to glorify him and to give thankfulness. Even the Buddhists in Nepal on some mountaintop. Right? Even the Native American that was sitting out here before any missionary came to the New World. They all have that testimony before them. Does that make sense?
Doesn't every person, no matter whether you believe in God or not, I mean, I think every person desires justice at wrong, when they're wronged or family members wronged, or
Yep.
whether they realize that justice comes from God or not, they have that inside of them too, that they
Good.
want that justice.
So we're going to talk about that. Because what does Romans 2 then tell us? Okay? Because the issue now is, what do I do with all these people that have never heard the Bible? You know, I mean, Israel, well, it was a few million people at maximum in the Old Testament. Really, that was it. That was the only people that God worked in significantly. So what about everyone else? Well, it says, Paul says, is for when Gentiles who do not have the law, they don't have specific revelation, they don't have the revelation of God, by nature do the things in the law, these, although not having the law, are a law unto themselves. Okay? That's complicated to say, but when they do it by nature, do the things that are in the law. So what is Paul telling us about men?
More argument once we fail God.
Because
Right, wrong. Because we know right and wrong. We know that we shouldn't.
because men will do what is right and wrong, innately.
We have a conscience.
We have a conscience. We know what is right and wrong. Again, I'm not arguing whether you suppress it. I'm not arguing whether you come up with 1,000 reasons why it shouldn't be true. I'm not arguing that it's been relativized into sociological norms and political laws and everything else. I'm not arguing that. I agree with all that. But God's word says that every man has the testimony of creation, and they have by nature the knowledge of what is right and wrong. Okay? They have a conscience.
I'm
Sorry.
Where's that verse, the consciousness of God is written on the tables of all men's hearts? Anyone remember?
Don't know.
I know it's there. I just don't know.
It sounds familiar, but I couldn't tell you.
Yeah, okay.
Now, they are a law unto themselves, who show the work of the law written in their hearts. I don't know if that's when you're looking for Romans 2. to show the work of the law written in their hearts, their conscience also bearing witness, and between themselves their thoughts accusing or excusing them, which is fantastic from Paul, right? C.S. Lewis once said, "My argument against God," this is him writing in the 60s in Mere Christianity, "my argument against God was that the universe seemed so cruel and unjust. But how had I got this idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. What was I comparing this universe with when I called it unjust?" So we have two things now we've been dealing with. Micah 6:8, to do justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with our God. And now in Romans 2, we see that the testimony of creation says there is a creator, and we have a conscience given to us that we should do justice, love mercy. And the creation of testimony is come humbly before your God and worship him. I love it when Scripture agrees with itself. Okay? Do you see it? Do you see what's happening? So God is just, and he says this is what's right, and we know what's right, and we have this internal feeling it's right, and we fight it. C.S. Lewis fought it. We all fight it. And now, the darkness is winning in many ways. But we still have what's right, and you still are conformed to it, and everyone has to conform to it. Okay? Am I going too slow? Do you want me to speed up? Or are you guys good? Okay. So, now we have a question. So what? I know what's right. I know what's right and wrong. I'm not doing it. I don't really care. Or I love what's right. I love to do what's right. I'm a good guy. Mother Teresa, all that kind of stuff. But I'm not as bad as Hitler, all those kind of things. Now you know what's right and wrong. You start to relativize it. Who cares? Why does it matter? For us as people. What do you think?
Why does it matter?
Why does it matter?
Because we live here on this earth.
Okay. Well, who cares if I do something wrong?
We'll be held accountable for it. Well, as nations go, certainly we care.
Okay. So beyond the socioeconomic impacts of immorality, why should I care?
Because there's implications. I mean, we don't think that there's end result from our inequities towards others.
Good.
There's a reckoning.
There's a reckoning based on what? Because who said there's consequences? Because God is just. And because he said it is appointed for every man to die once and then judgment. Judgment. So you are to act in the way that is right because in the end, guess what? There's a test. There's a test at the end of the semester. And the question is, how closely did you come to God's standard of what is right? Does that make sense? You will be judged. That is justice. He will be without partiality. Look at some of these verses here in Genesis and Exodus and throughout the Bible. Shall not the judge of all the earth deal justly? Again, a rhetorical question. God is, as he passes by Moses, this is fantastic. You can just sit there and just meditate on this for so long. And the Lord passed before him, Moses, and proclaimed, okay, remember he said, God, show me your glory. He said, you can't look right at me. Jump in the cleft of this rock, and I'll tell you all about it. And so he says, I will pass before you. And this is what he declares as his glory to Moses. The Lord God, merciful and gracious, long-suffering and abounding in goodness and truth, keeping mercy for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin. But ready? By no means clearing the guilty. I will be just. There will be a penalty. And that is part of my glory. When you see that, you are seeing God being glorified. When he treats men fairly according to their deeds. Okay? Romans 2, there is no partiality with God. And Revelation 19, we see that he is faithful and true, and in righteousness he judges. Now, it will be according to your deeds. Proverbs 24, if you say, surely we did not know this, does not he who weighs the hearts consider it? He who keeps your soul, does he not know it? And will he not render to each man according to his deeds? Job 34, for he repays man according to his work, and makes man to find a reward according to his way. Jeremiah 17, and to give every man according to his ways, according to the fruits of his doing, which isn't kind of scary. Romans 2, who will render to each one according to his deeds. It's a universal law, as Paul states in Galatians 5. You will reap what you sow. It's as true in agriculture as it is in your own morality, in your own soul. You will reap what you sow. Right? So, we know that he has a standard. We know what that standard is before him. And we know that he's going to, without partiality, he's going to treat us according to our deeds. Okay? So, we have two standards. One is the world around them, and we have the revealed Word of God that we've talked about. And so where does that leave us? Romans 3:23. What is it? Why? How do we know? Because he's given us multiple testimonies. Over and over again, we know what he's looking for. And over again, we reject it. We don't want it. Okay? But he has a standard for us. He expects certain things. And so MacArthur writes, exactly what charge is brought against humankind for the crime of rejecting God? This: even though they knew God, they did not honor him as God. The worst crime ever committed in the universe is the failure to give God glory or credit for who he is. But that is the essence of fallen men and women. When people refuse to recognize the divine attributes of God, that he alone is worthy of exaltation, honor, adoration, and praise, they have committed the ultimate effrontery against God. The Westminster Shorter Catechism states eloquently, the chief end of mankind is to glorify God and to enjoy him forever. But glorifying him is precisely what sinful men and women by nature will not do. Okay? So what will he do? Well, you can dispel any kind of visions of Peter sitting at the gates. You can get rid of George Burns in... no, you guys are going to get that one. John Denver. Which one is that?
Are you talking about?
Oh God, you devil. You guys ever see that one? George Burns is... Never mind. Another one. John Denver? What was John Denver? Which song?
It was the guy in the movie.
Oh, was it really?
Yeah.
I never got. I focused on George Burns.
You missed a movie.
Oh, George Burns with a big old... Yeah. That guy lasted forever. He just wouldn't die. Any kind of thing, shoulder angels, all that kind of stuff. God is not like that. When it comes to sin, God is just, he's got a stern, angry face. I mean, look at some of these verses. Psalm 5, for you are not a God who takes pleasure in wickedness, nor shall evil dwell with you. The boastful shall not stand in your sight. You hate all workers of iniquity. You shall destroy those who speak falsehood. The Lord abhors the bloodthirsty and deceitful man. In Psalm 7, God is a just judge, and God is angry with the wicked every day. I have yet to see that show up on any church marquee that I've ever driven by. It never comes out. And yet it's so all-encompassing. It's so universal, and it's so resolute. Do you see this? There's nothing in here that's uncertain. I hate all workers of iniquity. All. There is no qualification to all. All workers of iniquity. I'm angry with the wicked every day. Not some of the wicked, not the wicked that won't believe. I'm angry with the wicked every day. God is jealous and the Lord avenges. The Lord avenges and is furious. The Lord will take vengeance on his adversaries. He reserves wrath for his enemies. And what does Ephesians say about us before we were believers? We're children of wrath. He will take vengeance on his adversaries. He reserves wrath for his enemies. The Lord is slow to anger and great in power and will not acquit the wicked. Right? Romans 2. But to those who are self-seeking and do not obey the truth, but obey unrighteousness, indignation, wrath, tribulation, and anguish on every soul of man who does evil, of the Jew first and also to the Greek. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness. And there's nothing left but a fearful expectation of judgment and fiery indignation which will devour the adversaries. There is no hope in justice, because God will do what is right, and sin is wrong, and he will follow through and punish sin. Why will he punish sin? Because that's right. That's right, because God did it. That is the correct response to sin. Does that make sense?
Did you say there's no hope in justice?
There's no hope in justice.
It's just justice, right? There's no,
This is what he said he's going to do. Here's right and wrong. You're on the wrong side of things. Here's what I'm going to do to those who commit wrong. I hate all workers of iniquity. There's nothing.
Salvation is the only hope against that's justice. Would be salvation
Okay, yeah.
in Christ.
Well, we'll turn it over. The story is not over, but we are out of time, so this is where we're going to leave it.
Okay. All right.
I planned that. It was great. So we're going to turn this over because I'm telling you how resolute God is in justice, because there is a change in the New Testament where now justice becomes actually an ally. And we'll determine that next week. It's 2 parts this week. I know. Otherwise, we'd have a lot to go through still. I'm slow, but not that slow. All right. Any questions on that? We're going to stop there, and we'll pick it up next week. Because there is, I know a lot of you already know this truth. Nate brought it up last week of double imputation, but we'll continue through this. I want to take it slow because I really want you to turn it over. I want you to really come to terms with it. Part of it is, as I'm going through Pilgrim's Progress for our Thursday night study, I just got through going through Hopeful's testimony, where he talks about his conviction under sin, Bunyan's conviction under sin, and so kind of a lot of this stuff is fresh in my mind. So it's I'm going to go through this, but I want you to go through slowly and just really think about your own testimony, your own heart, how Christ works, how God has worked in you to go through this, and really see yourself as a sinner who really is just dangling over the pit of hell, but because of the mercy of God and the justification of Christ, you are as safe as can be. So that's my ultimate goal in this, but I want you to just continue to work through this, because I know a lot of this stuff for a lot of you is not new. A lot of you are familiar with it, you're familiar with the concept, some of you know it probably better than I do, but the personal application never ends. As long as you're alive, the personal application of this truth is just beautiful. Okay? Robin, you got something?
I just have the thought that we often hear the term inflexible justice,
Mm-hmm.
but that's redundant. I mean, all you need to do is just say
Yeah.
justice.
Yeah, to be just.
If you have flexibility in justice, then it's
Injustice. Yeah. Yeah, it's the same thing. There's one right and there's one wrong. It can't be both. So there can't be flexibility. Okay? All right. Let me go ahead and pray for us, and we will finish up there and pick up next week.